Welcome to Dana's Policy. I'm Charlene.
I'm Crispin.
And this is our Week in Review. Dana's Policy is a channel aimed at intelligent people where we discuss important issues facing life and society. But first start, how are you, Crispin?
Good.
Good?
I mean, what a week. So, I'm good. A lot of terrible things have happened.
Thanks. Why?
Afghanistan isn't great.
Yeah.
What's happening to Australia isn't great.
Mm.
What's happened to Lithuania with China isn't great.
Mm.
So we've talked about a lot of sort of less than upbeat issues. But no, I'm fine. I have been trying to, in this world of where all the countries in lockdown and the disease is continuing to spread and people aren't sure what the future is holding, I have been holding out hope that next year I'll be able to get to Europe for various reasons, go to Lithuania and other places, but also get on a cruise ship. I never thought I would want to be on a cruise because I thought, why spend all that money? Why spend all that money on a cruise when you could just go to the places you want to go to? Yeah. But then I traveled on a cruise ship, not to be on the cruise, but to get from A to B. And I realized in those few days that, I get it now. The hotel just rocks up to where you want to be. You don't have to unpack. You don't have to do anything. You just step off and you go and explore, and then you get back on, and there's all the food and everything. So I'm looking forward to that.
As well. Family and friends have always been like, we love cruises because of that very reason. You don't have to unpack. You don't have to worry about your stuff, more or less. There's food always there. It's a more or less like a banquet kind of style. So you're not stuck with like food that you don't like.
Yeah, I mean, I'm holding out hope of getting on a Cunard Queen Mary 2 ship. So it is super formal. So the informal nights are still mandatory suits.
Wow.
And the formal nights are bow tie tuxedos, right? And it's got the classic 1940s decor. It's all very old British style, lots of classical music and everything. A much older kind of clientele. So, I'd probably be one of the younger people there. But just being on like such a classic voyage would be just such a great thing. So these are just the fantasies I'm living in at the moment. Yeah. None of it is real.
So it's like a Titanic style.
Well, hopefully, yes, Titanic style, not Titanic result. Well, it's the Queen Mary 2, I think, is the only truly true ocean liner. So there's a lot of cruise ships that go around, sort of soft waters and stuff. But the Queen Mary 2 is built to go from across the Atlantic from London to New York. Yeah. I don't think I'd be doing the transatlantic. I'd do something much smaller than that. Yeah. Just the thought of getting on a cruise and seeing some place. I'm just so outside of my living area, like that would be so good. I mean, Australia's a beautiful place, but I definitely need to travel.
Yeah, I do want to travel, but I just can't stand cruise ships or anything to do with boats. Like, I'm a land animal. I just get I get really seasick. And even if I try those like anti-seasick pills or whatever, like I just get really tired and I feel worse.
Yeah, I'm with you. I can get seasick, but all of the YouTube videos and stuff I've seen on it, like from people that are just like, I get so seasick, etc., they're like, no, these cruise ships, that doesn't happen. They've just got perfect stabilizers. You never know you're on a ship. It always feels perfectly level. It's like being on land. And I don't know if that's true, but that is what the reviews say. So I'm willing to take a risk and see. But these are all just we're all living in the future now, aren't we? We're just trying to dream of it.
I know, yeah, for sure. And it's way busier, like for, I guess, states who are like have some restrictions, but like are able to go out more. Like people are going out. They're making the most of it because they know that tomorrow could change. So it's living within the moment. And I think, it's a big cultural shift, right? Like I used to be like such a homebody, like, I can't wait to go home and go watch movies and not see anyone. But now I have to be like, no, I don't have this freedom if something happens.
Speaking of freedom, I mean, Australia, I've seen a lot of international news coverage of Australia. And
why are they talking about us?
They're looking at us like we're a prison colony again, and that's the phrase that they're using. So during 2020, media outlets across the board were praising Australia and New Zealand for successfully suppressing the disease and now low numbers of contagions and deaths and so forth. And now, as they've all got vaccinated and are opening up and getting back to normal and just accepting that the disease is part of their their world now. Australia is seen in completely different terms of just being unable to live a normal life, in part because of a terrible vaccine rollout, but also just our extremely draconian measures by which people have been unable to participate in civil society.
Do you think the relationship between the Australian people and the government is unhealthy?
Oh, yes. It has. Well, it's become that way. So I used to think it was a net positive, our relationship with government. The big difference between, like, there are various differences between Americans and Australians. One of the big differences is that we have different attitudes to government. So the United States took up arms to overthrow a government and then put in very strict checks and balances, separated the legislature and the executive, made a very strong court system to prevent the resurgence of a government trampling people's rights, that a government should be there to serve the people, not rule the people. And Australians have had a much greater trusting relationship with its politicians. If you go to like the Simpsons episode of Australia, where the politicians are basically like everyone else hanging around the barbecue, like nobody could tell who the politician is, okay? And that was, I thought, good. It was part of our egalitarian society where you could kind of trust the politician to a degree on the basis that they at least had your same values and concerns, even if they were, they could be corrupt and everything else, but at least they understood. They understood what you were going through, right?
Yeah.
And now I think power has gone to the heads of a lot of these politicians who have been rewarded, tragically rewarded, for exerting a high degree of tyranny. And I was reading the comments on our Australia video, and one of the comments was about how, for example, in Western Australia, the Premier Mark McGowan is universally admired because he's managed to, at the time of this recording, keep the Delta variant out of the state, and people live with relative freedom, and he's just slammed up a hard border. I want to say in that video, I wasn't attacking any premier. What I was saying was that it is unhealthy, the separation and relationship we have both between us and the politicians themselves and the politicians with one another.
So the states, you mean? So like West Australians to Queenslanders to Tasmanians to South Wales and I don't know.
Exactly. We've lost we're all in it together. So at the beginning, there was the National Cabinet that was formed, where the Prime Minister and all the state premiers would get together and they would agree on a shared policy. And that was really good. It was a great unity. And then let's say there was an outbreak in Melbourne, our hearts would go out to them.
And they deploy. And yeah, it's really interesting, actually, the response in terms of like the COVID outbreaks, like in certain states, and then the response from other states when a fire happens. Or another crisis happens. Like there's all this like compassion and, we're here for you, mate. Like if you need anything, donations happen. Like we take action between states to, help, like Queensland with flooding, for instance. That always seems to happen. And yet with COVID, we don't get that. We get like there was that Simpsons meme of like everyone looking at that state and being like, are you serious? And it's kind of like the meme of like replacing whichever state's doing the most poor and replace it with Tasmania because
absolutely,
it's such a different mindset.
Yeah, and the comment I refer to is by John Matsakis, and he said, look, Western Australia and the eastern states have always been separate. I'm like, yes, but it's always been with the degree of tongue in cheek. There's been a lot of banter, but other than perhaps some complaints about GST tax distribution or something like that, there wasn't any animosity at all. They were all Australians, and yes, they would make jokes about how bad the weather is in Melbourne, but relative to Perth and so on. But otherwise, it was just, we're Aussies, right? But now people in Perth treat people from New South Wales as a mortal threat, right? And that is a different characterization of our culture. Right, like it's I think of one of the great stories of Australia, which was in their various camps in World War II, POW camps. You had British prisoners, you had American prisoners, you had Australian prisoners.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the weird things that was researched for decades afterwards was that Australian prisoner survival rates were obscenely higher than everybody else. That if you were captured in a Japanese POW camp, your chance of survival was 5 or 6 times higher. And the reason for that is because people assume that once you're in extreme situations, norms of society would break down and everyone would basically revert to their natural, survival instinct. Well, that wasn't true. Australians managed to keep these little welfare states going, even in the most extreme circumstances where, people would give up a little bit of their rations if they were in good health, and people who were sick were, other people would take care of their work and they would get extra food and be nursed back to health. And people took care of each other in these extreme situations. And there's a lot of great stories. Weary Dunlop is a great famous Australian iconic hero who, gave people jobs. Like there was this one blind guy who was like, I need something to do, otherwise I'm not going to be able to be fed. And he's like, well, you can cut hair. And he's like, I'm blind. And he's like, well, just put this bowl on the head and cut around the sides. And
that's
so this
how I got my hair when I was younger.
So this is it's this kind of narrative that Australia has, and sorry about the alarms. Is this kind of narrative that Australia has prided itself on as a great national story, but
I still see pockets of it in my own local community, like on Facebook groups and that. Like people are like, oh, I saw somebody that looked like they were hungry. So they went to the shops, went to go buy a chook or whatever, and then come back and help them out. And it's like, oh, I saw that same person also help blah, blah, blah. Like, I think there are pockets within the community, but I think as a whole, I don't know if that message is broadcasted.
Yes. I mean, and we definitely shouldn't neglect those small acts of compassion and support. But yes, at a local level, our national story is what's suffering here. And I'm very despondent about that state of affairs. I would much rather us all get the pandemic, all of us, than to lose who we are. Like that's just that's my own values. Perhaps people have different view. But if that's the cost, if we're going to view each other as potential plague bearers, and if we blame victims all the time, the media narrative on the lockdown protests has been extreme. Now, people have said, look, these people are out there spreading the disease, other people are doing the right thing, etc. And I'm not here to take sides in this at all. I can see the arguments. The people of goodwill can take different positions, okay? But the universal wall-to-wall coverage has been that these protesters are all selfish. They're just out to ruin it for everybody else. They don't care about grandma. And that cannot be true. Like the impact of the lockdowns has not been the same for different people. And the point of that video was to say initially there was a lot of support for casual workers, displaced peoples, unemployed and so forth, as well as people that got paychecks because they worked for government or they were in secure employment. But since those government initiatives have ceased, but those lockdown restrictions have remained,
and even probably harsher.
It is necessary. Oh, much harsher. It is by necessity impacting people to different degrees. And I find it really chafing when you've got like an ABC journalist who's, paid by government and the taxpayer, when you've got, government employees and outlets condemning people who are starving for looking for work, right? Like I find that really distasteful. It's something that we should, like if these protests are happening, the question we should be asking is why are they happening and how do we alleviate the suffering of those people so they don't need to protest? Now, there are different ways to do that. It could be that we realize that the lockdowns aren't working and we have to change policy. That's one possible outcome. The other possible outcome is, okay, these people are protesting because their kids are, are cutting themselves because they're not seeing anyone, right? What can we do to socialize? And I saw a tragic story yesterday in Geelong, Victoria. So rural Victorian area, probably no COVID at all, right? Rural Victorian area, but in lockdown because Melbourne is in lockdown, which means the state is in lockdown and Victoria is a massive area. Been in lockdown for most of last year, most of this year, and another 9-year-old committed suicide. I mean, you can't do this forever, right?
Yeah.
And yet we have managed to vilify these people, to vilify the victims in a way that I just can't believe it. And people get viruses. You know, we did so much good work during the 80s and 90s to destigmatize various diseases like the HIV, thing where for a while everyone thought, it's the gay disease, and it's only degenerates and prostitutes that get it, and we did a lot of work as a community to get over that kind of stuff, and with the pandemic we've gone backwards. It's like if you get it, you've done something wrong. And that's not okay. The other thing about it is the speed of lockdowns, and this is more a political discussion where again in that comment, and I'm picking a lot out of that one comment, but I think it speaks to the issue, where they're like, if Gladys Berejiklian, New South Wales Premier, had locked down immediately, like the great Mark McGowan has, that New South Wales wouldn't be in that position. Well, that's an interesting theory, except New Zealand got one Delta case, locked down the entire country immediately for exactly the same reason. They said, look what happened in New South Wales. And their
numbers keep rising.
It's spiraled out of control. So the lockdown so far hasn't curtailed the infections. And I would argue that in Western Australia's case, yes, one or two occasions the lockdowns worked well. But on another couple of occasions, I think it was just a boy who cried wolf situation. Someone with a past infection or someone who actually didn't interact with anybody else. The whole city went into lockdown. No one else got infected. And then the thing came out of lockdown. You could argue that if you just isolated that one person, you wouldn't have had the issue in the first place. Now, I'm not criticizing the WA government for being cautious, but it's not as clear-cut as right, wrong. They were all in a situation where these politicians haven't been in this situation before.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's equipped with this.
Dealing with variants that are unusual in their infectious rates, and trying to balance the harm caused by lockdowns, which is significant, not significant for people with guaranteed employment by the taxpayer, but significant for ordinary people, and also the health and well-being of the society who needs to be protected from the disease. This is a balancing act, and there is
such
no
a
right
wicked
or wrong.
Problem. Absolute wicked problem, and I definitely think what could help the situation is be able to just show more compassion, removing yourself from the situation and being like, okay, who are these people? And having an open mind, is it people on casual wages that can't work from home, firstly, are quote unquote essential worker, but they're non-essential in terms of just the field of work they are? Or are they living in rural remote communities that they can't call up Uber Eats to be like, can I have food? Because it's 300 kilometers away from the nearest shopping center. There are all these situations that, again, it's definitely uneven ground. And it is frustrating to some extent. Because I'm just like, because it's almost like I feel kind of helpless in a way. Because there's all these different forces around me, and I guess the relationship with the government is just like, it is a juggling act. And I like to think that people who are working in this space to, vaccinate the community and try to, quote unquote, get back to normal are doing with the best intention, the best evidence, I'm sure, right? Like they have good intentions. Or am I just being too idealistic?
No, I think no one thinks of themselves as the villain. Okay. I do have some concerns about Daniel Andrews, the Victorian Premier. He does seem a little bit carried away. I mean, remember the state of emergency in Australia, there is the emergency management protocols and the public health protocols. The legislation varies throughout the country, but essentially it allows the government to take total control over every aspect of a person's life to deal with an acute emergency. So if there's a pandemic and you need to lock everyone inside and bolt it shut, the government has the power to do that. They don't normally have the power to do that, but in a state of emergency, they do. Now, most of these have to be renewed like every 2 weeks. Okay, so So when the legislation was drafted, it was like, okay, there's a bushfire raging through this community, and we need to get everybody evacuated. And so we don't have time to argue about someone's individual right to stay in a burning house. We just take them and they go, right? There's something that the community can kind of understand, right?
Yeah.
But that's an acute temporary crisis.
Yeah.
And when the crisis is over, there's a review done to say, okay, was all the actions taken in that exceptional period justified given the risk to life and property that the crisis entailed? Well, when you've got these powers rolling on permanently, just rolling over almost automatically without even Parliament voting on it, then it's going to be very hard to track over 2 years of history. Was all the things reasonable, right, appropriate, scale?
Yeah, because I would like to know the assessment of cost, right? What is the cost of lockdown besides obviously spread of the disease? But okay, at this stage, Australia actually has quite low numbers, and we're very fortunate in that, in respect to different countries, right? Even within New South Wales, it's like 0.02% of the population actually has got COVID. 0.02%, because they have millions of people there. So yeah, what is the cost of all these different lockdowns to on the education, on the mental health, on their actual just general health, aside from getting the COVID disease, just social well-being? I don't know. I'm just it's like health. My brain just goes there. But there's all these different costs I don't know that are assessed when these reviews happen. Because is there a review?
Well, we're not at the stage of review yet because we're still in these rolling emergency laws, and so the politicians have gotten used to it. I mean, they once you've got dictatorial power over a 2-year period, very hard to give that up. I mean, really, only one person in world history probably handled that well, and that was Marcus Aurelius, the Emperor of Rome, who had absolute power and managed to contain himself for all of his life. From doing anything disgraceful. Well, I just don't think that people like Daniel Andrews are of his caliber, right? I don't think most people are equipped to have such power, particularly over a long period of time, without being corrupted absolutely, the great Lord Acton quote. So I'm concerned about that. I'm concerned about, politicians who start out with the best of intentions, who start to see the preservation of their own power and influence as being synonymous with the public good, making it, therefore, any threat to their own power and influence a threat to the country. That's a real risk. And I think that the fact that these politicians were initially rewarded handsomely in the electorates, the popular support and so on was very high because of the fact that the disease was kept low, they've got a kind of a natural inclination that only they have the great wisdom, and if they have to be strong in crushing the society to prevent the spread of the disease, then they'll do it. But I think as time goes on and the costs mount, then there's got to be a point where that seesaw starts to move. And I think the next federal election is going to be very interesting in Australia because Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister, he's had a kind of a bad pandemic. I mean, he was already heavily criticised. There was massive bushfire that hit us just before the pandemic, historical proportions, worldwide coverage. Well, he was in Hawaii. With
he's in Hawaii.
And his quote was, "I don't hold a hose, mate." Right? It was kind of like, "It's not my job." You're the leader of the country. There was a lot of, he got a lot of flack for that, and then he was very slow to move on the pandemic.
Yeah,
he recovered some of that currency with the JobKeeper and the job seeker increased support. It did look like he had gained control, created a national cabinet, had kind of a good response. but now he's back in the situation where he's fighting with the various premiers in the states. So
especially with the vaccine rollout, that's what frustrated me the most, and it still frustrates today, is just the change to messaging with vaccines, of like certain vaccines and favoring one another. I know like research changes over time, we're still learning about it, still developing, but like you said, we already had evidence globally of the risk for AZ, and yet we still continued and charged away. And then suddenly we lost trust within the leadership within Australia, and then we just had different rules wherever you were, depending where you lived.
Yes.
And it was just like, no. Like,
yes, and then public confidence was undermined. So what happened was, older people obviously have a much greater risk of the disease, and if you can get a vaccine that's effective and so on, you just get it, right? But when they started recommending that young people didn't receive the particular vaccine, older people were asking, well, what's wrong with it then? And people were, so they really undermined their confidence, and the messaging has a lot to do with that. So the vaccine rollout is a disaster. The supply problem was a disaster. The negotiation with the pharmaceutical companies was a terrible, failing. So there's a lot of problems there. So the Prime Minister and the vaccine rollout is a Commonwealth, ultimately a Commonwealth responsibility, because the Therapeutic Goods Administration, drug approvals, procurement of international drug sources, that's all Commonwealth, right?
Yeah, so, and they do relationships. Like, don't they have like arrangements with like Britain and everything like that? Is that how it works? Yeah, and then
they've had to do it that way as well. So initially the negotiations with the drug companies themselves, and then they've been buying up surplus supplies from other countries like Poland, for example. But that's ramping up. Like in the last month or two, there's been huge numbers of vaccinations, so that's good. We are getting back on track. But then the next election is going to be about opening up versus staying as we are. And I think it's going to be a really interesting campaign. So for the first time in a long time, we're going to have a real ideological political fight where I think, and I could be proven wrong about this, but I think what Scott Morrison will do, Prime Minister, will campaign on vote for us, the Conservatives, and you will have your freedom back, right? And the state premiers, the Labor Party, will be like, the government has screwed up everything, so they'll run on that.
Yeah, of course.
But they'll also say, we will protect you from the disease. So it'll be a safety versus, like a security versus liberty debate. And I think that, without sort of saying I hope who wins or who loses, I hope that the argument that's future oriented wins out, i.e., we will get the vaccinations done and we will open up, right? That we're going to get back to normal. We're going to get back to business, back to travel, back to everyday life. There was also a Qantas ad. The Qantas ad has a positive message of like people getting vaccinated and then being free and being able to go around the world. And a lot of people felt really warm and fuzzy when they saw that ad. Like, I've seen a lot of old men who are otherwise pretty unemotional get quite emotional when they sort of saw the prospect of that time long ago when they actually could go and see people and do things and live their lives. And that message, I have to say, is stark contrast with the government shock videos that they've been sending out, of people dying if you don't get vaccinated and so forth. So this is a much more effective, upbeat message.
Absolutely. I was like, I remember that time. I remember when I got excited to go see my family, and you just like pack your bags and you're like, I can't wait to see. Like, they had all of those like beats in the ad. It was so good, and doesn't need to, be gruesome or anything like that. And it's also really good to have such a positive messaging, a positive outlook, because ultimately we will be over this pandemic one day. So and it's good to look forward into the future, more or less, because I don't know, I feel like with all these restrictions, you just feel so like defeated all the time.
That's another comment that was on the video. I think it was Fitz, where he was speaking to his wife, and he's like, look, when this is all over, do you think things will get back to normal? And his wife's like, do you think it's ever going to be over? Hopefully It will be, and that Australia will come out of this the other side without not only with as a country that's positive, but also with its reputation sort of recovered and intact.
Yeah, for sure. I want to segue, right? We talked about Australia's politics and the federal election coming up. Now, this week you also talked about conservative and progressives.
Yeah.
I want to know, it boggles my mind in terms of progressive, like, how do you define progressive, because I think to myself, okay, if you achieve, say, universal education, you can still progress education. Like, there's still ways of making it better and more,
Yeah, so progressive messaging does two things. On the one hand, it advocates for a change. Like, that is an absolutely mandatory requirement. Right?
Yeah, but the degree of change is...
Yeah. The other form of messaging, which is the attack messaging, is the claim that the other side, the conservatives, will roll back changes that have been made. So if, let's say, you get universal healthcare, what every single left-wing party across the world does when there is universal healthcare is claim that at the next election, the Conservatives are going to defund healthcare, right, and force everyone onto private cover or get their own insurance or whatever. And that claim may or not be true, but it does get tied, particularly if the Conservatives continue to put money into public healthcare. And that's one argument. The other argument is, as you say, is, okay, well, you achieve universal healthcare, but perhaps dental isn't available. Perhaps, psychical mental health is underfunded.
Yeah.
And so they'll argue for those things.
Yeah.
And that's all well and good, provided it's something that stands to benefit a large number of people.
Right.
And what you're like, this also dovetails with the relationship with government. I mean, in the United States, a lot of people just want the government to do as little as possible. Just stay away from them, do nothing, right? If the government provides no services, takes no taxes, then that's ideal. The government can protect the country, that's it, right?
Oh, really? That's some
people believe that, right? They're like, okay, have a military and that's it. Yeah,
wow.
we don't want you to do anything else.
So law and order also?
Well, no, even law and order should be funded locally, right? Like they'll be like, oh, look, we'll get our community together, and through our charities and through our local council and the people that we deal with, we will organise all of the services. The federal government should do federal stuff. Stay out of our lives, right?
Interesting.
And that's a very American view.
Yeah.
In Australia, that's not the case. We're happy to pay taxes and receive services, right? And those services are what people are judged on, okay? So the conservative parties will always say, look, vote for us, we'll lower your taxes. And that works if the government is perceived as spending the money really badly, right? So if the electorate, if the Australian people, for example, see a lot of waste, a lot of mismanagement, have a crisis of confidence in government, that will benefit the Conservatives, because Conservatives say, look, vote for us and we'll do nothing. We'll just lower your taxes. And that works for some people. But it also aligns with Conservative philosophy, right? Individual choice, not taking people's money away.
Yeah, let businesses thrive.
Yeah. But the Australian electorate, and I think it's true for Britain as well, and probably Canada, reward politicians who deliver policies effectively. So if you introduce a universal healthcare system and everybody likes it and it perceives to be work, you will be rewarded for that effort. But you'll only be rewarded for it briefly, because it's the what have you done for me lately kind of argument, right? You get to the next election, you've got people with new ideas and new things that they intend to implement.
Yeah.
And unless you can convince the electorate that there's this whole new progressive change that needs to happen in order to either embed the success that's already been realized or build on future success, then you're going to be voted out, because the people just don't have an interest in that.
Right. So some people have interests in maintaining the status quo if things are good. That could... that's an argument in itself, I guess.
Yeah, and I think also there is one political scientist who I'll give a shout out to, Professor Matt Goodwin in the United Kingdom. He was the I think he nailed the 2020 US election, I thought, really well. And he's captured the zeitgeist in a good way as to what the axiom of politics now is. So, for example, you can be left-wing, progressive on economics, and right-leaning on culture. And this is the winning formula in British politics and certainly Australian politics as well. And I think in terms of political parties, what that means is the progressive parties can be progressive on policy, which is like service delivery. It's fine for a progressive party to say, look, we want to increase the marginal tax rate for this. We want to get rid of negative gearing for property investment, that sort of stuff. And people will either support or disagree with it, but large numbers of people will be interested, okay? Whereas if you're saying we are going to run on trans rights, well, we're dealing with a very small minority of people to begin with. The issue is highly controversial and often impedes other rights. Like, where does that flow into sports, for example, or prisons? These are issues that haven't been resolved, and so culturally, people are on the right. They're like, no, I think women should be in women's prisons or women should be in women's sport, and most people kind of feel that way, and therefore most people will support that view.
Yeah,
but they'll be like, economically, yes, there are people being left behind. Yes, there is a massive intergenerational wealth gap. It is very difficult for young people to get on the housing market. People are in more insecure employment. Jobs are being shipped overseas. So progressive politics would have a lot more currency if it focused entirely on those issues. The problem is that the adults aren't in the room anymore. These people are not in charge of the party because those achievements have already been done, and those that were working for those achievements have moved out of the trade union movement because once upon a time they were all unionized, so they would represent union interests, and therefore we were like, we want a sort of 40-hour work week, we want 8-hour days, we want paid annual leave, we want long service leave, we want sick leave, etc.
And or a superannuation, which they actually are raising now. Retirement tax.
Retirement savings. Think of your 401ks in Americans. So all of that stuff was had a lot of currency in the 80s, but once you no longer have a unionized workforce, once everybody's working for themselves, people don't see themselves as sort of workers anymore. They see themselves in they categorize themselves differently.
They're not defined by jobs anymore. Like, I feel like my parents' time, grandparents' time, they used to stay to like 2 jobs maybe. Now, like, I'm quite young. I've already had like 7 jobs, 8 jobs. I'm not joking, and I don't have enough time to be in one job to join a union. It's so everything's casual, short-term contracts. Like, there's no protection for the individual. Like, how am I meant to?
That's completely right. That is the world that we now live in, and there isn't anyone really representing that from an economic point of view.
Interesting.
So that really leaves it to play out in the cultural space, and the Conservatives are winning that cultural space because they're where the vast majority of people are, and that's
why can't you have both? Like, that sounds lovely to have, progressive policies and then conservative like culture, being proud of where you're from, like being a proud Australian, and then like, doesn't that sound like great?
But here's the thing. This is why you've nailed it. So here's why Conservatives are winning, because it's easier to move on economics than it is on culture, right? If you are from a political organization that has a certain philosophy, right, where you can say, look, we believe in low taxes, but we also believe in infrastructure spending, let's say. And the average person might be like, hey, isn't that government spending? We're not really into that as a Conservative party. But you know what? I don't really care. Like, it's going to win us votes, and I do want a new library or whatever. That's a different, people can be persuaded on those things. Whereas to say, you know what? I think that the family unit is no longer something we should support. That's a harder argument for the ordinary person, okay? And so the things that people have an emotional attachment to, things that they care about, much more difficult to change than just, oh, look, this speed limit didn't work. We're having too many road accidents, so we're going to lower it. Yes, it's a bit annoying for people, but everyone's going to be safer.
Yeah. It's a lot easier to digest than...
It's a change. Once it happens, people accept it,
Yeah.
And then, it's one of those things where people can ask forgiveness rather than permission. Whereas cultural change is much more visceral, and particularly when you're attacking the cultural narrative of your nation state. There's a weird psychosis that is only true in the Anglosphere, where here we have societies that have done more than any other to improve the well-being, the tolerance, the religious acceptance, the diversity of opinions and views than any other society in the history of the world, and yet goes more out of its way to denigrate its own achievements. Like, you don't see people pulling down statues in Mongolia, okay? Even though the statues they have are of Genghis Khan, and the statues that we have are of Winston Churchill, okay? Like, it's just, it's really bizarre.
It is bizarre.
So the progressive parties are in a massive crisis. And then we had I
wonder where it's going to go then if they are in a crisis. Like, where do these people go? Do they just kind of go down the social, cultural progressiveness?
I think they're pinning their hopes on demographic change.
Okay.
I think they're hoping that with immigration, with changes to so for example, let's say you've got 70% of the country that really believes in the glory of Britain and the wonders of its history in the British Empire. Well, if you bring in a lot of people that aren't British, who don't like that history, that see it as colonialism or whatever else, then you do increase the vote for the left-wing parties. So that's the main reason why immigration is so favoured by left-wing parties, is because they tend to vote left-leaning, unless they happen to be Asian immigrants or they happen to be Cuban immigrants. So for the United States, Asians tend to have a very conservative view of, work hard, get education, do a good job, like lots of strong work ethic, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that sounds like my parents all wrapped up.
Yeah, so they vote conservative. They're like, okay.
Also, they kind of do believe in the Australian, the American dream. Like, that is actually within the culture. If you work hard, you can achieve the quote-unquote dream.
Well, yeah, it's not for nothing you get like a 12-year-old who couldn't speak English come to America 2 years later, win the spelling bee. I mean,
true.
It's like, that takes a lot of work, So there is a very much self-help perspective. And I'm thinking of some funny Asian comedians who talk about that, which we will watch after this.
Okay.
But then there are the Cubans, those or Eastern Europeans, anyone who's lived under communism, right? So obviously the Baltic states, they're very conservative. Those that have lived in Cuba, who live in Florida now, they vote conservative. So the Democrats in America don't really want Cuban immigrants. they want Mexican immigrants, and so on. So it can run both ways, but most immigration supports the left-leaning parties because the left-leaning parties support immigration.
Interesting. It'll be interesting how it plays out in a COVID era where, do we open up? Do we not open up? Because that's immigration.
Yeah, although, I mean, it's a different form of opening up, of course. Like, I think Australians intuitively know that having a lot of foreign students is a good thing. For example... Yeah,
our universities are kind of crying at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, tertiary education was Australia's third largest export after minerals and food. That's a huge sector of the economy that's just completely ruined by the fact that we don't have any arrivals. And just, the fact that we're all intrepid and need to travel. So it will be very interesting how it plays out at the next federal election, but a lot more will play into it than just that ideology. Of course, as their competence will be a factor. But yeah, I don't see the social progressive parties need to have a new philosophy, a new raison d'etre. Previously, they could corral around the trade union movement, right? Even if they had their different offshoots, they had that workers' base, and then the workers don't exist now. They're in different forms of employment, so they need to have a different base. Whereas the Conservatives still have a base. They have religious base, they have a libertarian base, they have a business base, and so they've got that core base of support. So the bottom can fall out of the left-wing parties, but the bottom can't fall out of the right-wing parties. So there'll be a minimum number of voters that always vote Conservative no matter what. And the minimum number that always vote left-leaning is getting less and less over time.
Interesting. Great. You also talked about Lithuania and the fact that China is now going heavy-handed into this tiny country that they don't really have ties with, per se. But Lithuania is actually trying to set some example to the world of what can happen if you speak out against China and support Taiwan. But Lithuania are like, nah, and not standing down to it. Like, there's just so much courage there, I guess. Like,
this is a perfect example of the Streisand effect, where you do something in reaction to something that someone's done.
Yeah.
And by doing it, you bring everyone's attention to it. Okay. So it's like, oh, it's outrageous that this person has shared this thing on social media, and then everybody else shares it because they think it's funny, right? They would like never have seen it otherwise.
Because it's such a small country, right? Like, it just seems so, like, pathetic. Like, China is so big that there's other problems that they could be dealing with, but they choose this small Baltic country that, you know, wants to stick by their values and support the US. Like, it just seems really pathetic.
Yeah, and by the way, big shout out to Dana Moon. Let me know how to pronounce that. Who asked initially for us to do a video on the Lithuania-Taiwan thing. It was where it was first brought to my attention. But yes, it makes China look really small. You look as small, like you. One of the great lessons of life, and this is a lesson for ordinary people as well as countries, is you can really judge someone by the quality of their enemies. Okay. If you go after people that are bigger, more powerful, stronger than you, that makes you brave, right? Lithuania, very brave, right? Yes. China, very small, right? And this is something that the Chinese are going to learn at their great cost. If you start looking like a bully and you're willing to go out of your way to hurt tiny countries, then other countries are going to think about a world in which you're the most powerful nation and determine whether or not they are willing to support and facilitate that rise or whether they'll actively resist you. One of the things that the United States did successfully was universalize their rights. So after the Second World War, you had the United Nations formed, you had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. These were all American ideas, in which it said, look, no matter how small you are, you have certain inalienable rights. And the United States at that time had a third of the world's GDP, and could have decimated anyone it wanted to, but chose not to because it was a restrained power. Now, of course, it failed along the way in various respects, and people can point to the exceptions. But as Bill Clinton once said, and Bill Clinton was the president at the height of American power. That was like the great zenith. He said, look, we can focus on extending our power as long as possible, or we can set up a world that we can live in when we're no longer the most powerful. And what China is doing through this case of Lithuania is saying, we're going to be the most powerful, and this is how we're going to behave as the most powerful country. We're going to use our power in a maximalist way,
Coerce.
and not only coerce, but when we don't have leverage, they'll punish Australia directly. They put ban on our barley, they put ban on our wine.
Yeah.
They would get rid of our coal if they could, but they
Although,
can't.
fun fact with the wine. So I went on a little wine tour, and speaking to local growers, local wineries, they're saying that even though they don't get as many exports to China as much anymore, a lot of locals are buying the wine now. There's more stock for the locals, so like their business actually hasn't changed as much as they thought it would.
Yes, and also there was a temporary wave of people internationally buying up Australian wines sort of patriotically in support of our wine producers. And this is what happens to China. Like if you start punishing people for things that they don't like. For example, Australia just called for an international inquiry in the origins of the pandemic, the disease that wiped out, our entire international system. Well, people are going to start judging you and reacting to you accordingly. And if you go after a country like Lithuania, then people will start supporting. Not only will they support Lithuania, but they'll go out of their way to form coalitions to curtail your interests, and they won't allow themselves to be so dependent on you in the first place, particularly those Western European countries that are thinking about their future with China, that you could do the same to them.
Yeah.
And what makes it even more complicated, and something I will explore in a more detailed future video as well as some writings, is China's attempt to manipulate Russia to punish Lithuania. This is a really interesting angle.
Why is it interesting?
Because Russia doesn't... Okay, does Russia care whether Lithuania opens a representation in Taiwan or not?
No.
Right? Russia has zero interest in it. So, but Russia does have an interest in maintaining trade relations with Lithuania. Yes, they have political issues, but, Russia imports a lot of Lithuanian dairy products. Lithuania imports a lot of Russian gas and things. There is a like a trade relationship there, and there is an interest in improving relations over time, even if they're kind of cold and toxic now. Russia doesn't need to pick this fight with Lithuania over something it has no interest in and doesn't give a damn about.
He's like, well, I want...
The only reason they would be punishing Lithuania would be at China's request. And this is really fascinating. This goes to the nature of Russia's relationship with China. Does Russia want to be the junior partner in this coalition where it increasingly over time looks like a dependent and a client state? If it starts because what it means is harming Russia's own interest, i.e. trade relations with Lithuania, relations with the EU, for the sake of China's interest, subordinating its own interest for a foreign power. And that is a massive psychological shift. It's one thing to work on shared interests. So, you vote the same way in the United Nations because you both believe the same thing, or cooperate because you don't like, America's hegemony in the world. You want to create a more multipolar world.
Is that what
that makes sense?
Is that
they're
not US? Is that what
that's the main thing. I mean, ultimately, it's they don't want the US to be the number one power. They think that the US is a threat to both of their aspirations and security and so forth, and that pushes them closer together. And America has been hostile to Russia and to China. So there is, and they obviously have different political systems.
So America they might stretch it then, because Lithuania is building greater relationships with US, as it always is. So they might try to stretch that further and be like, oh, but it's linking to US. Like, can that be?
This is a whole new video that I'll do. Okay. No, it's a good point, because there's been work done. And I'll give a sneak peek, but I'll make this video next week, where after Second World War, the American military doctrine was to be able to fight and win 2 wars at once. Okay?
Yeah.
That is, in the Second World War, they fought the Nazis in Europe and they fought the Japanese in the Pacific, and they fought them basically as separate wars, and they won them both at the same time.
Yeah.
And after that became America's kind of military doctrine, that a war could happen in Europe and a war could happen in Southeast Asia, and they could go and fight them both at the same time and win both, right? Well, that's no longer possible with the great powers. This is something that just in recent years, the Americans have started to look at revising. They're like, okay, could we win a war against Russia in the Baltic state and China in Taiwan at the same time. If Russia invaded Lithuania and China invaded Taiwan.
Yeah.
Ugh, right? Because they require radically different force structures to deal with. They have different interests and focus and issues that arise from it and different levels of commitment and so forth. So it's not clear that that's possible. And now it's a military objective, a foreign policy objective of the United States not to be in that situation. I will go into depth about this subject in the next video when I explore the changing military doctrine and what it means for Lithuania and Taiwan, because they are linked in that way. The complicating factor for the United States, and again, some of this will be repeated, is that its most loyal allies in Europe, its most competent allies, are the ones most at threat from Russia. So the Baltic states, Poland, these are the ones pulling their weight in the NATO alliance. We've got France and Spain. They're basically dead weight. Even though they're much bigger countries, they're not really aligning themselves with American interests in the way that, Lithuania clearly is. So that does create a greater moral imperative for the United States to protect those countries because they're the most loyal allies. But they're also, unsurprisingly, the ones with the greatest external military threat, i.e. Russia. So this does create a military conundrum for the United States, which the Lithuania's actions in Taiwan has the effect of exploiting. But unlike some other news reports, I don't think that's the intention. I think that Lithuania isn't being, looking at a geopolitical map and being like, this is going to increase America's commitment to us. No, I think it's more they just don't like communists. Right? I think it's that straightforward, and they don't, and they like Taiwan because it's a democracy resisting a much larger communist power, and they feel that they're kin, and they can relate to that mentality. So I think that's what it's about.
Yeah, totally agree. I think that's all the time we have for today. If any questions, any feedback, please leave them down below. We do read comments. I've had a couple of fans. So shout out to all our fans. Otherwise, stay safe.
Ciao for now.